Good evening, Trinidad and Tobago. Welcome to One on One. I'm Nirad Tewarie. Tonight, I'm joined by Professor Rhoda Reddock, who is head of the Center for Gender and Development Studies at the University of the West Indies. And of course, she's one of the architects of the seemingly controversial draft national gender policy. Welcome, Professor.
Hi, thank you very much.
Now, Professor, a draft policy of any kind for government is one that usually takes place after consultation and so on. Was that done for this policy?
Yes, I think there was a very extensive process of consultation. First of all, we held a national consultation in June 2003 already, a long time, which was held at the Hilton, and there were representatives from throughout the country. I think we had about 400 to 500 persons, and that met for a day. It was to introduce the idea and to have preliminary discussions. I believe people even came from Tobago to participate. But that was followed by a series of what we called interest group consultations, which included meetings with the private sector, trade unions, representatives of the disabled organizations, the elderly, youth organizations, men's organizations, women's organizations. As well, we met with the permanent secretaries to appraise them of the process and to ask for their support.
So if all of this consultation took place, why then are we now seeing so much controversy surrounding the plan?
Well,
draft?
that wasn't all the consultation. In addition, we had 8 regional consultations, including a Tobago consultation. No, in addition, we had a full Tobago consultation, as well as interest groups consultations in Tobago as well. So it was an extremely consultative process. Why it has raised so much controversy? I think one, because one particular group zeroed in on 2 aspects of the draft policy, and those were issues dealing with sexuality. And I think that in this society we have not yet developed a mature way to deal with sexuality. So even though the society is increasingly sexualized, we cannot deal with sexuality in a serious, mature, or policy-oriented way. So as long as sexuality is in any document, the rest of the document falls away, and we zero in on this issue.
So, but a lot of people are afraid, religious groups among them, that this policy seeks to do 2 things. And one is legalize abortion, and the other is legalize and sort of make homosexuality part of the mainstream. Does it do that?
Well, actually, one of the documents I said that the document argues for gay marriage, which it doesn't. The document doesn't argue for any kind of marriage at all. What the document calls for is, one, for a public debate on issues related to termination of pregnancy, hoping to come to some position on the matter. And the document also calls for the extension of human rights to all citizens, and that no citizen, regardless of race, ethnicity, class, or sexual orientation, should be excluded from human rights. And I think that that is a principle that any decent society should adhere to. In other words, I cannot see a state willfully sanctioning discrimination against any citizen.
But does our state do that? Does the state of Trinidad and Tobago do that?
The state of Trinidad does. I mean, I'm not a lawyer, but I understand, for example, that many of the pieces of legislation, for example, the Draft Equal Opportunities Bill distinctively omitted discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation. I remember when that was queried, the then Attorney General stated that that was against the law and therefore the bill could not deal with it. I know also that I stand to be corrected that bills having to do with citizenship, I believe that is one of the grounds on which citizenship cannot be granted. I stand to be corrected. And also I remember there was a case sometime a few years ago where a citizen came before the court to claim domestic violence, and that case was thrown out because the argument was that that domestic violence took place among persons of the same sex, so in an intimate relationship. So I believe that there is...
Well, homosexuality is against the law in this country.
Well, that's what I understand. I'm not a lawyer, so I do not
Well,
know the
okay, well, I
intricacies
guess
of the law.
homosexuality is not, but buggery is still a crime.
Yes.
And a lot of people think that this policy means that government will have to take a look at those laws and
Well, we
so
are
on.
calling for many laws to be re-examined in the interest of, one, having a more just and fair society. And also we believe that many of the proposals that we have in the document would go a long way in dealing with many of the problems of education, of youth and young people, of youth criminality and other forms of criminality. In fact, I think this policy is a document that can really transform the society if there's a serious commitment towards examining and implementing it.
But, I mean, do you think that the document and achieving those goals of which you just spoke will get bogged down and tied down by the issues of abortion and homosexuality?
I think so, and I think
so
it's unfortunate because, in a way, the agenda is being set by a small group, and the rest of the population is not getting an opportunity to explore the many other issues which are available for discussion. For example, the document deals with child care arrangements. For example, calling for child care facilities at workplaces so that parents of both sexes, first of all, can be close to their young children so that children can be breastfed in, let's say, up to the first year of birth, which we all know contributes a lot to immunity from allergies in later life and many other problems. So we are also recommending changes in legislation to do with labor, changing in curricular issues relating to education. We are recommending re-examination of issues in relation to health, medicine, parenting, so many issues.
But do you think, you know, you were talking about the anti-discrimination legislation and so on. Do you think that what will simply happen to the action plan and policy is that the references to abortion and homosexuality will just be taken out and we would skirt around the issue again?
Well, I have no idea. I think what will happen, I think it depends on the political will, but also on the voice of persons in the society who, who want us to move to another stage of social development. And I know that that in the society we tend not to have an informed view. We don't read a lot, so we may not understand these things that sound very threatening and also appear to be very disturbing. And I think that is probably because of the need for wider and broader knowledge and understanding, which I hope as the society moves forward would come to pass. I think as an educator, I would really like to see a society that is more learned as opposed to a society that has more paper qualifications, because that's one of the problems I think we are facing.
Now, you spoke about political will. I don't think, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I think the only politician to ever try to deal with the issue of homosexuality was Gillian Luckey and her contribution to the debate in Parliament, and even that was over a specific issue. I think, if I'm not mistaken, it had to do with transsexual or something like that. It was a very specific issue that was being debated. But really, it doesn't seem, or I don't know if the politicians have ever broached that issue in public. And certainly abortion, we don't hear politicians speaking about it.
I think there's a lot of fear, and I think that hopefully the opposition, when the time comes, would also take a principled and open position on these matters and not, You know, in other words, I think that that these are factors that affect society. They affect many people very seriously, and we need an informed discussion, which I think we have not had. And I think that we at the center would be willing to provide information, background knowledge, which could help make an informed decision as opposed to one that simply, you know, responds in a very...
Now, you spoke of the opposition. Are you anticipating that they will either oppose or...
No, I'm not anticipating anything. All I'm saying is that I hope that, that in the interests of the society and its well-being, that they would really take the opportunities that are presented by the... I mean, we at the center, we at the University of the West Indies, our major funder is the Trinidad and Tobago taxpayer, which is why we undertake these kinds of work, because many people believe that, I mean, the university, we have a responsibility. We teach our classes. We publish in journals. That's how we gain our scholarly reputation. But we also have a responsibility to the society, because the society affords us the opportunity to read and study and examine issues in a way that's
Sure.
not possible for all. So therefore, we do feel we have a responsibility to provide the kind of information on which politicians, practitioners, lay people can make a more informed decision. They don't even have to listen to what we say, but we'd be willing to provide them with material that can assist them in making their own decisions.
Now, moving away from those two controversial issues, as you said, there are many other issues discussed in the plan, and one of them that piqued my interest was the issue of attempting to get young males through the school system successfully. And how are you tying that into the gender plan, and what are your solutions?
Okay, I'm glad you raised that, because that was also one of the issues that was raised by this group. They accuse us of seeking to redefine masculinity, and I think that in the policy we do have no problem with that accusation, because we think that that's a very important aspect of the plan. In other words, a lot of people may not understand exactly what gender studies and gender analysis is about. And in the plan, we go through a very extensive discussion. Nowhere in the plan does it state anything about 5 genders, as was stated in the in that newspaper article that was carried by that organization. But we do explain gender, which basically we understand as the social and cultural mechanisms through which men and women learn what society expects of them, and this is what we refer to as masculinity and femininity. And what we explain and what we argue is that these things are not necessarily biological, but are very much determined by society's values, by the socialization that we get, by culture, etc.
Now, okay, now, in discussing that issue, you all talked about the fact that subjects are grouped somewhat in terms of, at present, that the system groups subjects, there's a gender bias in the grouping of subjects.
Well, the thing is that whether the system groups them or not, the society develops clear ideologies of what is masculine and what is feminine.
So are you saying that you'd like to see more women or more young girls in woodworking and so on, and more young boys in home ec and baking and so on?
Well, we would like to see that, but you see, the thing is that what we have come to understand is that because it's much easier for girls to move into predominantly masculine fields because they gain in prestige, but it's much more difficult for males to enter predominantly feminine fields because their masculinity then is questioned. And therefore, for young males, because of the fear of being seen as less than men, less manly, less masculine, the pressure on them to constantly prove their masculinity, to me, is one of the reasons for many of the problems that we are experiencing today. And as the lyrics of the popular songs become more homophobic, young men are under even more pressure to be manly, and manly in ways that are often very destructive to them and the society. So we want to open up spaces so that young men don't have that pressure to constantly respond to peer pressure or other kinds of pressures to do things that are not perceived of as masculine.
Some other sociologists might counter that, well, one of the things that attract women to men is their masculinity and the perception by the female that the male will be able to protect in times of a crisis when need be. And if you start blurring those lines and men and women do the same things, and then it becomes more difficult for pairing and so on later on.
Well, I think that was an old anthropological approach where it was argued that in order for adaptation in a situation of in hunter-gathering societies, but I think we've come a long way from there, and I think that maybe if we accept that argument, which I don't in its entirety, then one can suggest that that behavior is no longer something that is that is useful anymore. In other words, maybe that behavior was a behavior that developed in an earlier time, but today that behavior in my instance is working against young men than in their favor. So for example, we in the situational analysis, which is part of this document, one thing that we found is that one of the largest causes of death for males in our society is accidents, homicides. And accidents and homicides, especially accidents, are much lower in the causes of death for females. So in other words, the kind of masculinity that's currently practiced is one where men are not supposed to acknowledge risk. They're supposed to be fearless.
But did you also do research to find out how many more men are driving than women at that age group?
I'm not referring only to motor car accidents, accidents in general. In other words, accidents that result from not weighing and taking cognizance of the risks involved.
So are men less able to discern risk?
No, but masculinity requires that you do not show fear, that you take risk. That is one of the very key components of masculinity, and that's why many men die unnecessarily, because they cannot show fear, they cannot acknowledge that if somebody says, if you come down the road, I'll shoot you. They have to go down the road to show that they're not afraid. Now that is a very loose and probably not the best analogy, but what I'm saying is that risk, taking risk, even when the odds are very much against you, is part of what the kind of masculinity, and we are saying that is no longer useful. It never was, in my view, but it's certainly not useful today. And unless we do something very serious, that's one of the reasons for the heavily involvement in violent crime. It's not the only reason. There are other problems that affect that, but I don't think you really want one of my gender studies lectures on this class,
but
on this program. Sorry.
We heard Prime Minister Manning a few years ago say that one of that women becoming more and more involved in the workplace is men are having a hard time adjusting to it, and I'm paraphrasing him, of course. Do you think so? And if not, or if you do, how much of an impact would it have had coming from the Prime Minister?
All right. This is why I think the need for information is so important. First of all, I always remind people that in the Caribbean, the majority of our ancestors, male and female, came here to work on the plantations, right? So women as housewives is a relatively recent phenomenon in our history. That is the first point. If you look at our censuses for 1890, 1900, you'll see large proportions of women recorded as in the workplace, because that's what we came here to do, to work on the plantations. Plantation masters didn't want housewives. That was clear. So it was in the post-emancipation period, and especially coming up to the middle of the century, we begin to see the increase and exclusion of women from wage labor outside of the home. But even when women were excluded from formal wage labor, many women, as you know, in rural areas continue to be involved in agriculture. They continue to be involved in market gardening. They took care of animals. So this whole question that women were not working until the other day, and that is historically inaccurate. Now what you find is that by the middle of this century, there were larger numbers of women excluded for a number of reasons, including legislation, which I don't have time, but also ideology, and also changes in the whole labor market and how it was organized. So what is happening now refers to the point I mentioned before. Women, in a quest for what they see as equality, have been moving more and more into areas traditionally defined as masculine. And this is especially in the professional areas. Because for the majority of women and men at the bottom, not much has changed.
Right.
But let's say the profession, which is a very small proportion of the population, you find that women have been moving into areas traditionally seen as masculine, law, etc. Now, one of the characteristics of gender relations is that whenever women enter an occupation or an activity in large numbers, men leave. So what has happened is that more and more women move into occupations. Men...
Why is that?
Well, it has a lot to do with the way in which masculinity is constructed. Because since femininity is seen as less valued, the understanding is that once you have lots of women in activity, the activity itself becomes less valued. So men, in order to maintain the status of their of masculinity, and what is happening is that there are fewer and fewer spaces where men can go and not find women, hence the crisis. So it's not that women are replacing men, it's just that the real traditional masculine areas.
But do men and women need that? Do men and women need spaces for just men and just women? And I don't mean in the workplace, but let's say, take for example the Queen's Park Cricket Club, or any club. Do women sometimes need a girl, the extension of a girl's night out or a boy's night out? Do they need that?
I'm sure they probably do. I'm sure they do. And in fact, there are many more spaces for men to have those nights out than women.
No, but I'm not talking about the nights out. I'm talking about things that men do to be men, and things that women do to be women. And do they need those spaces for them to coexist?
I'm sure
in
they
harmony?
do. I'm sure they do, but I think the cricket club is a bad example, because I remember asking some of the women, and they said, this is not a cricket club that is in a little private place. This is more or less the premier cricket club which hosts the test matches, and therefore, in other words, you can't have a very public institution being segregated. But definitely, I think that there are times and places where men and women can have spaces, and especially, I think men now need spaces to discuss issues of masculinity. What happened is that male spaces often become spaces of peer pressure. And I'm not saying peer pressure just among youth, but even among adult men. Research in other parts of the world find that it's in these spaces that men are pressured, sometimes into very negative behaviors that sometimes affect them very negatively, but not wanting not being able to stand up to that peer pressure can be very negative. So I think we need constructive male spaces where men can work with other men and young boys in dealing with the challenges that face masculinity at this time. I think there's definitely a need for that. You see, over the last 3 decades, women have created those spaces for themselves.
Such as?
Well, women's organizations, women have said, is our behavior, is the way in which we have existed in the past, is that useful? Do we need to change? I think men also need to do that. And the gender policy is one way of helping the entire society
so
do
just
that.
just to get two things clear before we leave. The gender policy says on the issue of abortion and on the issue of more on the issue of homosexuality, is that it needs to be discussed.
Yes, it needs to be discussed, but also that there should be all citizens should have human rights under the law. No group should be discriminated against.
And on the issue of abortion, it does advocate that in certain instances, that abortion be legal.
I think it calls for a public debate in order to further that process. But I'll have to read it more carefully, but I don't want to say anything that isn't there. But I believe it calls for a public debate on the issue.
So it doesn't call for legalization?
I don't think so.
Okay. Thank you, Professor Rhoda Reddock. It's been a real pleasure having you here. She is head of the Center for Gender and Development Studies, talking to us right here on One on One. I'm Nirad Tewarie. Please enjoy your evening and stay tuned to IETV. We have a lot more in store for you. Take care. Yeah. So.